If you look at France from the outside, you'll see this: stunning architecture, world-class cuisine, rich culture, and some of the most visited cities on Earth. A country that symbolizes elegance, prosperity, and a high quality of life. In many ways, an ideal nation. But if you look closer under the surface, you'll see that while all of that is true, there is another, much darker side to life in France. Unbeknownst to the world, an entire generation has been left behind. Nearly 20% of young people can't find stable work, and many who do are stuck in low-wage temporary jobs with no future. Homeownership is out of reach. Retirement feels impossible. For over 8 million young people, the promise of a better future has been broken. This isn't just an economic crisis. It's a generation at risk of being left behind forever. This is the dark side of France, the forgotten generation. While this is now mostly forgotten, there was a time when France was seen as an unstoppable economic force. It was one of Europe's wealthiest nations, with a thriving middle class, strong worker protections, and a welfare system that promised security for everyone. For generations, France's model was admired across the world, a system where education, hard work, and stability seemed guaranteed. It seemed so certain that France's economy would remain strong that few questioned its long-term sustainability. The government played a major role in shaping its success. Strict labor protections and powerful unions created the illusion of an unshakable system. State-backed industries thrived, and people believed that as long as they followed the system, they would find stable jobs, own homes, and retire comfortably. In many ways, France appeared to have mastered the perfect balance between capitalism and social welfare. Unlike other nations that embraced extreme free market policies, France maintained a strong safety net. Workers had job security, students had access to high-quality education, and the cost of living remained manageable. And for generations, it worked. French companies dominated industries like aerospace, luxury fashion, and high-speed rail. The country maintained a high standard of living, and even during global downturns, it remained one of the most resilient economies in the world. But this success was built on fragile foundations. The same government protections that once made France strong eventually led to stagnation. Strict labor laws made companies reluctant to hire. A rigid job market made it nearly impossible for young people to find work. And while older generations were able to benefit from the system, younger generations found themselves trapped, facing rising costs and fewer opportunities. For generations, France was a country that promised stability. But beneath the facade, that stability was already beginning to crack. By the early 2000s, warning signs were everywhere. Rising debt, slowing growth, and an economy that was not as unshakable as it seemed. And then in 2008, everything changed. The global financial crisis sent shockwaves through France's economy. Growth stalled, businesses shut down, and unemployment skyrocketed. But while most countries eventually recovered, France never truly did. The job market became rigid, making it harder for young people to find stable work. Wages stagnated while the cost of living continued to rise. Housing prices soared, making homeownership a distant dream. And despite government efforts to revive the economy, many of these problems only got worse. At first, people believed this was temporary, that things would bounce back, that the system would eventually correct itself. But as years passed, it became clear. France's economic struggles weren't just a phase, they were the new reality. A reality where young people entered the workforce only to find dead-end jobs, temporary contracts, or no opportunities at all. A reality where entire industries began to decline, leaving thousands without work. And while the government continued to pour money into the economy, the underlying issues were never fixed. Strict labor laws made companies hesitant to hire. High business taxes pushed corporations to move elsewhere, and a rigid social system made it nearly impossible for young people to advance. As a result, unemployment among young people in France remained one of the highest in Europe, with many forced into unstable, low-paying jobs that barely covered basic living expenses. Over time, frustration turned into resentment. Protests erupted across the country, led by a generation that felt abandoned by the very system that was supposed to support them. France had gone from a country that promised stability to a country where an entire generation was left struggling to survive. But while this was a drastic downturn, economic struggles happened everywhere. But in France, it was different. Unlike in other countries, this economic collapse had devastating effects on an entire generation, effects that millions have never recovered from. Because in France, failing to get a stable job early doesn't just make life harder, it can lock you out of the system for good. For a long time, the path was simple: get a degree, land a stable job, and build a future. But in France, that system has broken. The job market is so rigid that missing your first opportunity can leave you with no way back in. Workers who entered the system at the right time had access to stable, long-term careers, often protected by strong labor laws. But after the 2008 financial crisis, that system broke. Companies stopped hiring new graduates to protect older employees with long-term contracts. The job market froze, and thousands of young people found themselves unable to get their foot in the door. And because France's system was so rigid, once they missed that first opportunity, it became nearly impossible to recover. Even as the economy improved on paper, many companies still refused to take on full-time employees. Instead, they shifted towards short-term contracts, part-time jobs, and internships that led nowhere. Wages stagnated, but the cost of living, especially in cities like Paris, kept rising. Many young workers found themselves trapped in low-paying jobs, unable to move up the economic ladder. The result? A generation of educated, skilled workers with no stability. For those lucky enough to find jobs, the struggle was far from over. Many were forced to work multiple jobs just to afford rent, while others moved back in with their parents well into their 30s. Home ownership became an impossible dream, and the traditional milestones of adulthood, buying a home, starting a family, were pushed further and further out of reach. And then there were those who never found work at all. The number of young people classified as NEETs, not in education, employment, or training, began to rise just like in Japan. Many became discouraged, giving up on job hunting entirely. A growing number of young men in particular withdrew from society, barely leaving their homes, relying on their families for survival. This wasn't just a temporary setback. It was the start of something much bigger. For the first time in modern history, young people in France were on track to be poorer than their parents. The economic system that had promised prosperity to previous generations had now abandoned them, and no one in power seemed willing to fix it. This is the forgotten generation, a group of young people who did everything right yet ended up with nothing. And a broken generation doesn't just disappear. Over time, the effects of their struggle began spreading to the rest of society. At first, many believed this was just another downturn, something the economy would recover from. But as the years passed, it became clear. This wasn't just a phase. It was the start of something much bigger. Young people who can't find stable jobs delay starting families, leading to declining birth rates. Fewer homeowners mean a weaker economy, as entire generations lack the wealth their parents built. And with an aging population, fewer workers are left to support an increasingly expensive welfare state. At the same time, resentment continues to grow. Protests, strikes, and political instability are becoming more common as young people fight against a system that has failed them. Many have already given up on France entirely, looking for better opportunities abroad. A brain drain is beginning to take shape, with thousands of young professionals leaving the country every year. If nothing changes, this won't just be an economic crisis, it could become a social and political one. A generation without opportunities breeds instability, and the frustration felt today could shape the political landscape for decades to come. A nation that was once seen as a beacon of opportunity now faces a future of uncertainty. And for millions of young people in France, the question remains the same. Will they ever recover?